nation in the making would get disrupted, so that the whole legacy of the anti-colonial struggle would actually be lost. Now, this is something which was called
The recording has stopped.
this idea of having a certain strategy of development which harnesses
This meeting is
capitalism
being recorded.
but is not classical capitalism. It was called by various people under various names, but it was not socialism because the bourgeoisie was very much there. Capitalist development was taking place. This was called by very many people under by very many different names. Jawaharlal Nehru called it the socialistic pattern of society. A very well-known Polish economist, Mikhail Kalecki, called it the intermediate regimes. Many others, I would like to call it the dirigist regime, the regime in which the state played an important controlling role, regulating role, even though it was a regime in which capitalist development was taking place. Now, this regime is one which I would not go into the contradictions of this regime, why it collapsed and so on, but this regime is something which was overthrown and substituted by the neoliberal regime in 1991, particularly. Many people date it back to 1985, but basically in 1991, this regime, this dirigist regime, was substituted by a neoliberal regime which undid all, which tried to undo all these things. Now, one very important component of the dirigist regime was bank nationalization. Bank nationalization was a very key element of the dirigist regime. Why? Because typically, prior to that, big houses had their own banks, and therefore centralization of capital, enormous amounts of resources used to be mobilized in the economy, and these resources were put into the hands of the big capitalists to use as they like. They used it for taking over small firms, they used it for speculating, they used it for their own investment purposes, and so on. Now, if you're going to have controlled capitalism, if you're going to have a capitalism that does not encroach on petty production, that does not encroach on small capital, that actually ensure that these sectors also tend to prosper, in that case, you also have to earmark bank credit to these sectors. Then you cannot have a situation where all the bank credit is monopolized by the big bourgeoisie. Therefore, having a that was an absolutely essential component of the dirigist economic strategy. Therefore, bank nationalization was not just some small measure. Bank nationalization was really a measure to carry forward the legacy of the anti colonial struggle in building the nation. Now, therefore, in this context, in 1991, what you had, as I said, was the substitution of a neoliberal regime for the old dirigist regime. This substitution has been changing the structure of the dirigist regime down the line, across the spectrum, if you like. Firstly, this has meant that for cash crops, price intervention by the government to ensure that the peasants get a remunerative price has gone. You have all those tea board, coffee board, coir board, rubber board, and so on, which actually, are concerned with all these cash crops, but they don't have a marketing function anymore. As a result, you find that the peasants tend to get squeezed. In the 1930s Great Depression, see, I'm deliberately going into history because it is not often appreciated. You see, the entire anti-colonial struggle in India took off in a big way in the 1930s. Why? Because the peasantry joined it in large numbers. Why did the peasants join it in large numbers? Because the peasants felt the pinch of the Great Depression. The Great Depression brought about acute misery as far as the peasantry was concerned. And it is this misery which actually pushed them to say that, look, we are not going to be for this kind of a regime. We want a government that is going to save us, that's going to protect us. And the anti colonial struggle made the promise that come independence, you never again face the kind of misery that you are facing now. Now, that is why the marketing function, or in the case of cash crops, was also important. It was exercised not through the Food Corporation of India, but through all kinds of specific commodity boards and so on. And the marketing function of these boards was completely done away with. And because of that, you had this situation where international price fluctuations then began to affect our domestic peasants producing the cash crops. Then they got into debt exactly as they had done in the 1930s, because if the price crash, they get into debt. And when they got into debt, then they couldn't pay back the debt. And many of them, as you know, committed suicide. 3 lakh peasants at least have committed suicides in the last 3 decades, which was unprecedented, unheard of, and certainly in post independence India. It's a shame and a blot on the nation that so many peasants took their lives because of the fact that the protection of the state was withdrawn from them under neoliberalism. Then you had a situation where now you carry over the same attack on peasant agriculture, which began with the cash crops. Then there was an effort to push it towards the food grains. As a matter of fact, the international agencies, the WTO, has been US imperialism has been trying its best to roll back the procurement operations and the procurement prices as far as food grains are concerned. Okay. In fact, this has been the stumbling block as far as the Doha round of WTO negotiations are concerned, because they say that, look, you are giving them, the state is procuring too much, you just leave it to the free market. And that is what the three farm laws, which are now being enacted by the Modi government, are really trying to do. The Modi government is carrying forward the agenda, has taken on the peasants in a big way, and the consequence of that is that for 8 months you're having this peasant agitation. So the protection accorded to petty production and peasant agriculture under the dirigist regime is gone in the case of cash crops, and is now going in the case, or attempted, government is attempting to let it go in the case of food crops. Now, likewise, we know about the integrated with international finance capital, and that international finance capital is now in a position to enter our country, leave our country, and so on. We have a capital account that is reasonably open, not fully open as yet, but reasonably open, because of which no government can really afford to do anything against the wishes of international finance capital. Suppose a government wishes tomorrow to do something, and international finance capital would leave the country in large numbers because it doesn't like what the government is doing. And if international finance capital leaves the country in large numbers, then there will be a financial crisis and so on. So, exposing the country to the free flows of international finance capital is a way in which the country's sovereignty gets completely undermined. No matter who you elect, they all follow neoliberal policies. Now, the World Bank and the IMF say they do so because these policies are very good. Not at all. They do so because all of them are worried that as long as the government is caught in this web of financial flows, anything, any alternative policies not liked by international finance capital would immediately give rise to capital flight. Finance would leave the country in large numbers, and that is what going to create a lot of transitional difficulties. Not in the long run. In the long run, is very good for the country, but immediately it will create problems. And no bourgeois formation has the courage to really, in the virtues of privatization, privatize the biggest bank, that is the State Bank of India. Several American emissaries like Tim Geithner, Lawrence Summers, who are all their Treasury Secretary and so on, who are big financial bureaucrats in the US, have been coming here to India in the past and have been pressing the Indian government to do it. And the Indian government has not been able to do it precisely because they are worried that they are going to face a lot of opposition. They are worried that unions like yours are going to raise their voices against such privatization, and the people at large are going to raise their voices against privatization. It is because of such privatization that credit was firstly this private so sorry because of the nationalization that the banks went all over the country. In fact, I remember some decades ago, every day, so many bank branches were being opened. The whole country became banked because of the nationalization. And secondly, bank credit was really disbursed much more widely. I remember as a student, as an undergraduate student of economics at Delhi University, we used to have to write tutorials. Why institutional credit cannot go to agriculture? And then we all wrote tutorials that transaction costs are high and this and that. But the point is that actually institutional credit went to agriculture after bank nationalization. And the Green Revolution was a product of that. Therefore, not only was the agricultural sector, peasant agriculture, petty production protected from encroachments by big capital, but they were in fact provided with credit precisely because of bank nationalization to ensure that they did not really have to go to money lenders, they did not have to face the kind of crisis and problems that they used to face in the pre-independence period, that they actually had access to institutional credit, and what is more, a certain proportion of the bank credit was earmarked as far as they were concerned. Then, with the bank nationalization, again, a firm line was drawn between production and speculation. That basically nationalized banks did not indulge in speculation, even though after 1991, after liberalization, banks were, had a certain leeway. Nonetheless, when the 2008, financial crisis struck the world economy, Indian banks were relatively free of this. The only bank in India which actually faced some problems was the ICICI Bank, which is a private sector bank, who did not have nationalized banks facing any problems at all. As a matter of fact, it was found that the total assets of the nationalized banks that were held, I mean, the total foreign assets of nationalized banks and the proportion of their total assets was only 7%. And not all these 7% were toxic assets. As a result, they had a trivial exposure to all the toxic assets. And why was that? Because of the fact that with nationalization, banks were discouraged from speculating with people's money. So the emphasis on production, diversification of institutional credit to the small users, because of which green revolution could take place, and whatever else you may say about green revolution, it has made the country self-reliant as far as food grains are concerned. self-reliant, admittedly, at lower levels of intake, but we are no longer dependent on the Americans. We are no longer dependent on what used to be called from ship to mouth. That food grains would come by ship and imported, and those food grains would go from ship to mouth. We are not a ship to mouth economy. And as a result, what is called food imperialism, the, the exercise of dominance by the advanced countries on the third world, because they provide food aid to the third world. India had experienced it till the mid 60s, but since that time, India has been free of this kind of food imperialism. And a very important reason for that is bank nationalization that has actually made credit available to the peasants to carry out the Green Revolution. Therefore, in all these ways, bank nationalization served the country in actually building up, if you like, the dirigist system, and insofar as the dirigist system has been attacked, large parts of it have crumbled, neoliberal regime has taken its place, but the neoliberal regime has still not been able to kind of do away with bank nationalization, because of which the nationalized banks have still carried on with the good work they were doing, not fully. In fact, they themselves have slid back because of the pressure of neoliberalism. I'll give you one instance of this pressure. One peculiar argument began to be bandied about. What is that argument? That public sector banks are not profit making. You see, the public sector banks were not supposed to be profit making. The public sector banks were supposed to serve the nation differently uh, from the private sector banks. The private sector banks emphasize profit making. That is why private sector banks don't give credit to the peasantry. Private sector banks engage in speculative lending. Speculative lending is something which is, of course, more profitable because it is more risky. But on the other hand, the public sector banks did not do all this. Because they did not do all this, somehow the argument got to be floated and the media picked it up that they're inefficient, which is complete nonsense because they were playing a different role. They were supposed to play a different role. In fact, their whole raison d'etre, the reason for their existence, the reason for their being nationalized was that they must play a different role. Before nationalization, many of you may recollect, there was a period of social control over banks. That basically we don't really need to nationalize. We shall simply control the banks to make sure that they give credit to others. But no, that didn't work because of which Indira Gandhi nationalized the banks. Bank nationalization was done in order to ensure that the banks play a constructive, different role from the private sector banks. Now, the private sector, if you are a private sector bank, you have to make profits. But on the other hand, this whole idea began that look, they don't make enough profit. Look at private sector banks, they're more profitable. Completely bogus ideas. But unfortunately, in our country, these bogus ideas, particularly when pushed by the media, tends to acquire some kind of a currency. And this is what happened. But notwithstanding all the calumny against the nationalized banks, 2008 demonstrated that India was one of the very few countries in the world that was not touched by the financial crisis in US and the EU. And why was it not touched? It was not touched precisely because of the fact that Indian banks had not gone in for the speculative lending. And therefore, they held very little toxic assets in their portfolios, which is why they were immune to the kind of crisis that came. Now, it is in this context, however, that again the pressure has mounted, and we have a government that is, of course, neoliberal to the core, and what is more, it is extremely right wing, adopting neo fascist or fascistic methods in order to suppress dissent, in order to suppress opposition, and therefore the international finance capital and the Indian big bourgeoisie think this is a very good opportunity to do what could not be done earlier, namely have at least some of the banks getting privatized, and then from that, then more and more banks will get with international finance capital being in a hegemonic role behind the neoliberal policies, you can actually see how banks are so important from its point of view. Here's a country which is pursuing neoliberalism, but on the other hand, the country has nationalized banks. So this anomaly, from their point of view, is what they are trying to get rid of by demanding that banks be privatized, maybe one, two at a time, but slowly over a period of time they must be privatized. Already, as you know, bank equity holdings, quite a lot of it has been privatized. It's perfectly possible for a businessman to actually acquire even up to 40% of banks, so the equity of many banks, because of the fact that over a period of time there has been a tendency to sell off, saying that no, government is holding majority holdings. But on the other hand, government holding majority holdings is something that is really not sufficient, because if a partner holds 40% of the equity, then that partner would have a say in the running of the bank. And already, therefore, to some extent, we have succumbed to the pressure, but not fully. And it is this which is galling as far as international finance capital and the Indian big business is concerned, because of which the pressure is again mounting that banks be privatized. Suppose we privatize banks, what is going to be the impact of it? You see, bank privatization is not an individual thing. As I mentioned, bank privatization is really part and parcel of the attack on the petty production sector and peasant agriculture that has been going on. One way of carrying forward that attack is to make sure that institutional credit doesn't go to them. They go to money lenders, therefore, private money lenders who have now started mushrooming again. They pay exorbitant interest rates. They cannot really pay back the debt, and therefore they commit suicides. And many of them give up agriculture altogether. Peasant agriculture is in a crisis. Between 1991 and 2011, 15 million cultivators have abandoned cultivation. Where they have gone, we don't know. These are census figures. Some of them may have become laborers. Others may have migrated to cities in search of jobs, but there are no jobs. The rate of employment creation in the country is less than the rate of growth of the work, the natural rate of growth of the workforce. Therefore, the in this period, you find that even the natural rate of growth of the workforce, which is because of natural population growth, cannot be absorbed because of this drastic fall in the rate of growth of employment generation. In that, if you have displaced peasants who flock to cities in the quest of jobs, then of course you get into a situation where there's an enormous widening of the pool of unemployed, underemployed, and so on. Because of which there's a widening in the number of people who are poor. By the way, you must have seen everybody, I'm not talking about the pandemic, everybody is going to give you this statistic because they fiddle as far as the definition of poverty is concerned to show that no, the poverty has been going down and so on. We are having 8% growth rate and so on. No matter what percent growth rate we are having, there has been an increase in poverty. Let me give you one or two figures. First, the proportion, let us take nutritional norms, because poverty in our country originally used to be defined in terms of whether in rural areas somebody had access to 2200 calories per person per day. And in urban areas, if somebody had access to 2100 calories per person per day, if you had less than that, you were considered poor. If you had more than that, you were not considered poor. That was the original Planning Commission definition of poverty. Now, the point is that if you look at exactly that proportion in 1993-94 was in rural areas 58% of the total rural population. That proportion in 2011-12 was 68% of the total rural population. In other words, hunger, malnutrition, undernutrition, all of which were basically the core of the definition of poverty earlier, have actually increased. In urban areas, the proportion was 57% in 1993-94. It has gone up to 65% in 2011. What has happened after 2011-12? Even more horrendous. These are the years I've chosen, 1993-4, 2011-12, are years in which the National Sample Survey, which was a huge statistical enterprise, the Indian Statistical Institute, set up by Professor Prashanta Mahalanobis, in fact, used to carry out the National Sample Survey. Nowhere in the world did you have a larger survey than the National Sample Survey. It was a pride of India that actually here is an underdeveloped country, but that has such a wonderful, enormous sample survey. Statistically, it was unprecedented anywhere else in the world. Every 5 years, the National Sample Survey had what they call a large sample survey. But every year they used to have a small sample survey. The years I have been talking about, 1993, 4, 2011, 12, are the years of large sample surveys, which are really kind of major. The next large sample survey was in 2017-18. And you found in 2017-18 that the entire rural population had a decline in real terms in its per capita consumption, which was 9%. In other words, an average rural person in 2017-18 was consuming 9% less in real terms, in absolute terms, compared to 2011-12. Unprecedented in the history of post-independence India, unprecedented. And this is something which is a legacy of neoliberalism. Therefore, anybody who says the neoliberalism brought us great growth and so on, well, one doesn't eat GDP. I mean, GDP growth means nothing. Fundamentally, how have people fared under neoliberalism? And people have fared under neoliberalism through greater undernutrition, malnutrition, and hunger. They have done badly in terms of getting indebted and suicides. There's a crisis of peasant agriculture, and all this is something which the present government, unmindful of what's going on, wishes to push forward, which is why the peasants are demonstrating at the Delhi borders. So, this pushing forward of the neoliberal agenda must be prevented. It must be prevented to ensure that the people do not suffer even more. Independence was meant for the people. It was not meant for big capital. It was not meant for the urban middle class, which may have got a few, which has certainly benefited from neoliberalism. It was meant for everybody. But on the other hand, vast masses of the people have actually become, in absolute terms, the figures I gave you, more hungry and poorer. Inequality, of course, has increased. In fact, some of the inequality figures are staggering. Two French economists actually looked at inequality in India from income tax data. Income tax in India was introduced in 1920. So they had access to all the data from 1922, and they found that the proportion of total national income, which used to accrue to the top 1% of the population, actually was had gone down to as low as 6%. 6% of the total national income accrued to the top 1% of the population in 1982. You remember in the old days, 1922 onwards, it was the lowest. And 1922 onwards, we had Maharajas, we had all those rich people and so on. And the proportion of national income accruing to the top 1% was 15, 20, 16, 18, and so on. And it had gone down to 6% by 1982, which is just before economic liberalization. But with economic liberalization, in 2013-14, it was as much as 22%. So imagine from 6%, the top 1% share in national income increased to 22%, which was the highest that it had been since 1922. In other words, the level of inequality in 2013-14 was higher than when India had all the Maharajas and Zamindas and so on, who were so rich and who got such a large share of income. So inequality has increased, but many people concede that inequality has increased. But on the other hand, they say, yeah, yes, yes, inequality may have increased, but poverty has not. As a matter of fact, I'm arguing that the rise in inequality has also meant, in fact, a reduction in the consumption of the poor, and in fact, an increase in the magnitude of poverty. Therefore, if this is the case, then what nation are we talking? What nation building are we talking about? Are we remaining faithful to the Constitution? Are we remaining faithful to our anti colonial struggle? Are we remaining faithful to the concept of the nation for which the people of this country made sacrifices and fought British imperialism? British imperialism was not fought so that only 1% of the population can really get enormous amounts of the growing national income. British imperialism had fought so that, as Gandhiji had said, wipe away the tears from the eyes of every Indian. Now, if you have to do that, then you have to have a regime that controls this rapacity, that controls this tendency of capitalism to encroach on other sectors, that controls the tendency of capitalism to deny credit to the other sectors by having control on the financial institutions. But if we are therefore going to prevent this tendency from going forward, if we are going to ensure that 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 the petty production sector, peasant agriculture, small capitalists do not go under. Because if they did, then there'd be huge unemployment in the country. And even though you have even higher GDP growth rate, the huge unemployment in the country would really create an ocean of destitution because there'll be not enough jobs, and the ocean of destitution would actually increase naturally the measurement of poverty and so on. If we're going to prevent that, if we're going to prevent that, then we have to fight against neoliberalism. We have to fight against this extreme right wing government that wishes to carry forward neoliberalism under the cover of the pandemic by putting opponents in jail and so on, which has done the anti-farm, the three anti-peasant farm laws were passed during this pandemic. Similarly, the attack on the workers' rights was carried out during this pandemic. So we have to fight this tendency. We have to fight against the carrying forward of neoliberal agenda. Neoliberalism itself is in a crisis. Now everybody look what's happening in the United States. I mean, whether they going to succeed or not is not the point. I mean, capitalism, whether it'll allow them to succeed. But what is Joe Biden doing? What Joe Biden is doing is reviving the pre-war tendency of a New Deal, that he's actually suggesting that let us have income transfers to the people, income transfers to the poor, which is something that is going to generate demand so that we can get out of the crisis. Neoliberalism is at the end of its tether. Neoliberalism, I don't have time to go into why it's in a crisis, but neoliberalism is in a crisis. And of course, to get out of the crisis of neoliberalism, it is important to think of something else. While in our country, our government, in fact, to say to get out of neoliberalism, let's have more neoliberalism. Let's actually have even banks privatization, where everywhere the effort is actually to get out of, to extricate the economy from neoliberalism. Whether they succeed or not is a different point. But the point is everywhere. The effort is to extricate their economies from neoliberalism, while here the effort of our government is to push the economy deeper into neoliberalism. This effort has to be fought, this effort has to be resisted, and a very important component of that resistance must be the resistance against the privatization of banks. Because that is a very key component, as I said, of the dirigious regime. And of course, now that that we have to ensure that banks remain the nation's property and banks continue to give credit, institutional credit, to peasants, to agriculture, to small industry, to petty production sectors, and so on. So the fight against bank privatization is not just a trade union issue. Trade unions are in the forefront of this fight, but the fight against bank privatization is an issue for the survival and prosperity of this nation. It's an issue to prevent mass destitution. I think with that I should stop. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Professor Prabhat Patnaik. You touched upon right from the colonial war fight and emergence of the public sector and bank nationalization